everyone. Welcome to High Renaissance and Mannerist Art. This is our second unit, and these are the artworks that you're most likely familiar with when you think of the Renaissance. So we will get to those. However, before we get to our main guys, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, let's talk about how they got there. So the High Renaissance and Mannerism takes place in the late 15th century and most of the 16th century. So some mark the beginning of the Renaissance with Leonardo's Last Supper. Others mark it at the turn of the century. And I'm going to side with the art historians who mark it with the bonfire, the vanities. And so we talked about with the early Renaissance that it primarily was focused in Florence. It was the Medici that were able to sponsor these artworks and that believed in art in a way to increase human potential with humanism, etc. And so Lorenzo de' Medici, the head of the family, the patriarch, he dies in 1492. And this basically ends the golden age of Florence. And Rome becomes the center of the Renaissance. After that, we have this almost like a crisis, and where things shift from a less secular and academic and philosophical study of life, and where some very jealous other families use the excuse of religion to erase the Medici way of thinking. And this results in the bonfire of the vanities in 1497. So this is where they start to burn many of these philosophical books and artworks, etc., that don't adhere to like a very strict Christian philosophy or theology. Again, using this excuse to take control. Erasing the message of the Medicis under the guise of this religious crusade to an extent. And so many of these important items are burned in 1497. One of the many examples in the world in which art is unfortunately destroyed for personal gain. And so, this is what I find a big marking point for the High Renaissance. However, we have some examples of the High Renaissance coming before this. Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, and so the focus shifts to Rome. And so if we're going to talk about the High Renaissance, we need to discuss Pope Julius II from 1503 to 15. He commissioned so many of these artworks that we studied. He's reinforcing this papal authority to leave a legacy of wisdom, of good taste, that these are aesthetically pleasing. He's spending a lot of money on art. We're going to talk a little bit later about how this increase in funds actually leads to the Protestant Revolution. And so, he's still emulating, the High Renaissance is still emulating classical antiquity. It's a little more conservative because we are at the epicenter of Christianity in Rome. But again, under this patronage, we wouldn't have the artworks that we think of when we think of the Renaissance, or what many think of when they think of art. Okay, so let's remind ourselves of Fra Filippo Lippi, Madonna and Child with Two Angels. We saw his influence on Botticelli, his student, and we're going to talk about Verrocchio and Leonardo. So, you probably are quite familiar with the Mona Lisa. However, before the Mona Lisa comes Verrocchio. Let's compare the two for a minute. So I'll give you a brief moment to look at these images, see what's similar, different. So, Andrea del Verrocchio was Leonardo's teacher. FYI, Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci means from Vinci, from the town of Vinci. So when you hear people say Da Vinci, it's like they're saying, oh, from Houston. So when we refer to him, we'll say Leonardo, or at least I'll try to, because it's pretty ingrained in pop culture to say Da Vinci, but you're just saying from Vinci. Anyway, so Andrea del Verrocchio, this is Lady with Flowers, 1475 to 80, so we're going before this bonfire, again where I was saying late 15th century. He's not part of the High Renaissance necessarily, but we'll see how this is a good transition and helps to formulate many of the ideals and which our leader, Leonardo da Vinci, realizes. And so we see not so much emotion within her face, and that's going to come a little later, but when we consider like her gesture, consider the placement of her hands. Hands are so difficult to draw, to sculpt. It's one of those, almost an assessment of the skill of an artist. But we see the delicate placement of her fingers. There's almost this protective gesture. And how she seems to be contemplating something, looking off in the distance, and the hands help to communicate this. So there is this sense of emotion in that regard. She's holding these flowers, and of course this looks extremely realistic. This looks like a real individual. She's idealized, but she's also individualized. It looks like a real person, not just a generic Greek face, as we discussed in the previous unit. Her clothing looks realistic. I mean, consider how this is marble. This is stone. And he's made this look like a thin cloth. He's made the hands look like hands. So incredibly skilled. There's this sense of symmetry. It doesn't need to be perfectly symmetrical. This balanced composition, this sense of order, and realism. And so we see these key components play out in our High Renaissance. I like the National Gallery of Art, the way how they describe Verrocchio. In some, his statues and reliefs combine meticulously observed realism with idealized beauty derived from the study of antiquity, and they display an unmatched skill in rendering ornamental detail. So remember how we talked about that ability to create such details of these different textures as a sign of skill. But I want to focus on this term observed. Consider how we started to see that with the early Renaissance of observing the world around you, with linear perspective, like really sitting there and just looking and considering how to create three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional space. We see that play out in the High Renaissance, this sense of observation. You may be familiar with, and we'll go into that in a minute, about how Leonardo da Vinci is known for his observation. His drawings are left behind of how he sat there sketching and observing, and that comes from his teacher. So again, look at the details of these hands. Goodness. The realism of the body, the different textures. And so from one of your assigned readings, and from the video you were to watch before this lecture, is this idea of observation. We know about it because of the preparatory drawings left behind, of how they would sit there with like a model in front of them, or just out observing people, and sketch how to create this image, the placement of these fingers. And so this sense of observation is the importance of observation is important with understanding the High Renaissance, where you're really sitting and contemplating. So consider how philosophy, which is essentially thinking, was so important in the early Renaissance. Same thing with the High Renaissance, where you're really thinking about how to portray your subject matter. And so let's see the influence. So if we consider the hands, look how similar these hands look. Okay. See the clear teachings of this master Verrocchio. So here we have Leonardo da Vinci, his old age, when he was younger, well, somewhat. And again, so he just has countless papers of observations. He also, one of the reasons why he's so known for his realism is because of his study of the human body. He actually was studying cadavers, the deceased individuals, to really determine the muscular system, etc., in order to really understand the different muscles that are flexed when in different positions, etc., in order to portray those realistically. So all these preparatory sketches. Consider this sense of highlighting and shadow, light and dark to create volume. Terms. Consider looking at how different muscles are used in different positions. Oh, one thing to note is some of the process, like with Brunelleschi, how we don't know the process of how he built that dome. Many of these artists were extremely secretive about the way how they did things. One of which was Leonardo da Vinci, where he has this odd script, and he writes in this code, and he also writes it backwards. So that's why that looks interesting. So Andrea del Verrocchio was actually a goldsmith. He was more known for his sculptures, so consider this relief right here. And again, preparatory sketches, preparatory sculptures beforehand, before he creates his final piece. Look at our sense of space, the realism of the body, this order, this balance. We still have our very classical antiquity elements here. So the arch and the columns, etc. So again, we're in Rome, so they're looking at the originals. There's again, preparatory wood in preparation for his final piece. And of course, they're looking to the previous masters we'd studied. Donatello. One of the other marks between the High Renaissance and early Renaissance is many of the early Renaissance artists that we studied had passed away. They were the previous generation. So here's Donatello's David compared to Verrocchio's David and how similar they look. He obviously went to Florence, studied Donatello's David. This youthful David, the underdog. Here's our Baptism of Christ, in which the assignment readings discussed, a video, and how we have tempera and oil on panel. And so here is when Leonardo da Vinci was part of his workshop. He was one of these apprentices working under Verrocchio. And Verrocchio did the majority of this painting, but notice how this angel stands out, how it looks different than the other figures. Part of that is the softness of the brush strokes, but also it's because Leonardo da Vinci favored oil versus that tempera paint, the egg yolk paint. Instead, he preferred oil. And so part of the reason why this figure looks different is not only because of the brush strokes that are softer and the style is different, but it's because of the use of oil paint. This realism of this individualized figure. Each of these look like real people. And consider the different textures, hair, the soft wispy curls, the clothing, etc., and a real sense of the body. So we know about this, well, A, because it looks different, but we have one of our first, which many argue is the first art historian. I'm not so sure about that. Part of his writings was exaggerated and trying to elevate his own work. We have a later German, Winkelmann, who's really the first art historian. But regardless, this early biographer of many of these artists, Giorgio Vasari, an Italian, wrote, "In this work, Verrocchio was assisted by Leonardo da Vinci, his disciple, then quite young, who painted therein an angel with his own hand." So we have a writer discussing this time period and telling us who created this angel. So luckily, Giorgio Vasari, in his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects from 1550, gives us some insight into many of these artists of this time period. So here's Madonna of the Rocks by Leonardo da Vinci. Oil on wood, so he's using our oil. Yeah, consider the composition. So when we're looking at the composition, we have this very triangular shape, which is often favored with depictions of Mary and Christ. This triangle is often associated with Mary. And let's consider some of the terms that we learned in the last unit with this idea of atmospheric perspective. And in this case, sfumato, this extra version of atmospheric perspective where it's very hazy and foggy looking, and where Leonardo da Vinci uses the landscape to take up much of the space. We have our foreground where we have John the Baptist right here, his mother Anne. our figure of Mary, of Jesus, and notice how just even looking around, that line is used to draw our eye around. We're drawn toward this illuminated figure here. The line of her arm leads up, and then Leonardo da Vinci's literally pointing. I mean, he's using line to draw you to the other figures. And here's Jesus. So remember Fra Filippo Lippi and how we talked about his landscape, and I mentioned that he would influence Leonardo da Vinci. So consider how these rocks look extremely similar. Now this focus on the landscape. So we can trace this lineage of these artists. There are two versions. Da Vinci had numerous versions, the Louvre versus the National Gallery of London. And so this is another reason why I had the assigned reading about the preparatory drawings and the video, is because that's so important with understanding these figures look so similar because he's usually using the same cartoon, that same cartoon to create these compositions. Have a close up. These soft brush strokes. So here's some more of his preparatory drawings. And there's our Madonna of the Rocks. So if we were looking at this painting and had to choose formal elements, we'd choose line and how that leads your eye around the painting, as well as you could argue color. Your eyes are drawn to different areas, such as the red of Anne's, the cloth that she's wearing, brings you to Mary. She has a green cloak here. Often she has a blue cloak. So he portrays her a little differently. Light and dark. Probably color would be the least one that I would choose. Light and dark with this sense of highlighting, these illuminated faces versus the shadow, etc., to create this sense of volume on the body. Or I would analyze figure style with these realistic figures. They look individualized, so not just these generic faces. They look like real people. They're idealized. You know, he's studied the human body. He's studied the muscular system of the body. So numerous formal elements to study. And let's talk about the Last Supper. So you are likely familiar with this artwork. Many art historians use this work as the beginning of the High Renaissance because it incorporates or pretty much encapsulates our ideals of symmetry, balance, order, realism. Look at our linear perspective, right? I mean, just so beautifully done. Our atmospheric perspective behind them, our vanishing point around Christ. He is centrally placed. The light is behind him, so our eyes are drawn toward him. Consider how before we were seeing, I guess I don't have it on here, before we were seeing Christ with halos, etc., for much of time, whereas now Leonardo is using the light behind him from these windows. So the Last Supper is found in the refectory, so like the cafeteria of a monastery for monks. And so this is appropriate. These monks would dine in silence, listen this prayer state, and consider how they're dining in silence and how they're looking up, and they're considering Christ's Last Supper as they eat. And so they're reminded of this important event. So this is a New Testament biblical story of Christianity, where before Christ was crucified, he was aware that he was already betrayed. And so he has this Last Supper with his disciples and these 12 gentlemen who were his loyal followers for the most part until after. Or many of them were. But anyway, and so we have these figures, and They're eating the bread, they're eating the wine, which becomes an important part of Christianity, and this idea of communion, of reliving this moment, of this anticipation of Christ's sacrifice, of him spilling his blood for humanity. And so right here, in this scene, we see the moment where he tells them that he knows he will be betrayed. And we're going to look at all their different reactions. However, I first want to note that the Last Supper was a common theme in Christian art. But Leonardo da Vinci creates this common theme, this common scene, differently. First of all, again, here was the halo picture. He's not depicting the halos. He considered the facial expressions they lack emotion. And as well as the placement of the figures will be different. But part of the Renaissance is the sense of emotion. Now I want to sidetrack real quick, since we're talking about the Last Supper, and talk about Sister Platoila Nelli. She was a self-taught nun. She taught herself how to create artworks. She was the first known female Renaissance painter. She's up in Florence, and so she's looking to those early Renaissance artists. So women, for most of time, you have the domestic sphere, or if you wanted to pursue, not every woman, but if you wanted to pursue something else, you would join a convent, or some would just be join a convent for financial reasons or whatnot. But either way, this convent era setting enabled her to experiment and to have time to create. And so here is her artwork, The Last Supper, 1560s oil on canvas. And so let's just appreciate for a moment how incredible this artwork is for a completely self-taught artist, and how realistic these figures look. The details are extraordinary, from the folds on this tablecloth to the clothing, to the faces, to the individuals. Okay. So Jesus was betrayed by Judas. And the standard was for Judas to be on the other side of the table, that he is separated from Christ. He, by choice, has betrayed him for money. And so here we have the other disciples, and here we have Judas on the opposite side. Leonardo da Vinci does not do that. Quick note, notice how we have John right here, where he looks, some argue, like if you've ever heard of it, or the Da Vinci Code, a book and then a movie, that he looks very feminine. It's not that he is a female. Think back to our David, where he is shown as youthful. This idea of depicting him as more almost prepubescent or just coming of age versus all of these clearly older men, etc. So that's why he's depicted that way. It's an artistic skill to show the difference. And so we see that here, again with this John. One thing to also note is that this artwork was, come back to this, bombed during World War II by the Nazis. And so, yeah, it has been redone over and over and over again. So essentially what we're seeing is not really even the original. Like, there's likely very little of Leonardo da Vinci's hand that we're looking at. Part of that is also because you'll see that this is a fresco painting. So fresco is where you have plaster on the wall and you're painting on this plaster. Now remember, Leonardo da Vinci takes his time. He is really into observations. He is notoriously slow, much to the frustration of his patrons. We have many unfinished works. And so this plaster dries pretty quickly. So if you're painting a fresco and you're painting on the wet plaster, you need to do so quickly for the paint to really adhere within this plaster and to last. And oftentimes Leonardo da Vinci did not work quickly enough. And so the paint would be on dry plaster, it wouldn't really stick. They even spoke about how it was already beginning to fade while he was still alive, etc. We have evidence of that. So not only the bombings that destroyed this monastery, but also the fact that it had already been redone, and it was already disappearing, unfortunately. But anyway, so what we're looking at here is Christ centrally placed, right? Look at this orderly composition, this sense of symmetry. He is again in this triangular position. Part of that is also the idea of the Trinity with Christianity, of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, which is a major component within the theology of Christianity. Red and blue, these primary colors also make him stand out. And so he has his hands open. He has just told his disciples that he has been betrayed. And look at all their reactions, all these emotional reactions. And now he's grouped these figures into threes. Okay, we have these 4 groups of 3. And they're defined by, like, the shock. Consider the hand gestures of these 3 individuals. What? And then we have these figures, and they're like, what, me? I would never do that. Versus these figures and these figures. And so there's this sense of emotion across all of them, even with Christ. And I'll give you a moment to see if you can determine who Judas is. So again, normally he's depicted on the other side of the table. This is your standard, but not this time. Okay, so our only figure that is leaning back, consider all the other figures are leaning forward even if they're discussing amongst themselves, is Judas. And he's also portrayed a little bit darker in order to stand out amongst the other figures. So here we have our betrayer. We have our orderly composition, our linear perspective, primary colors, our atmospheric perspective in the background. We still have some of our classical elements. Consider the interior. And our groupings of 3. And so here is your Last Supper. Here are the different figures. Restoration. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. Another key moment to note is that Leonardo da Vinci is extremely intentional with his depiction of the background. He's created a sunset in the background. Well, it's dinner, but also the argument is that it symbolizes the end of Jesus' earthly life, that he will then be crucified. And these different figures and how he's depicted them differently. And Jesus has a real emotion as well. He does look sorrowful. It is sad to have one of your closest companions betray you. And our focal point, of course, is Christ. And here's the Mona Lisa, which you're likely familiar with. So, one of the most popular artworks of the world. If you ever go to the Louvre, you really can't even get close to this. The room is just full of tourists squished together trying to get to this artwork. So one of the reasons why people are so drawn to it is this smile, this ambiguous smile. You look at it for a moment, she seems genuinely smiling, and then you consider how it seems like a fake smile, and it just goes back and forth depending on what you're thinking, essentially. This ambiguity, this mystery is such an engaging element with the Mona Lisa. It pulls in the viewer. Consider how we have his very characteristically sfumato landscape around her. The hands that we saw were influenced by his teacher Verrocchio. And so some of the arguments, people just love this artwork, is that she's the wife of this dignitary, this wealthy silk merchant, Lisa Gherardini, hence the Mona Lisa. Vasari also mentioned that Leonardo employed, while he was painting this figure, that he had employed different musicians and troubadours to keep her amused. So there's an argument of why she has this enigmatic smile, this mysterious smile, and how she's looking directly into the viewer's eyes, which goes against etiquette. This is a little risque when you consider it, that she is looking directly at the viewer. Normally their eyes are averted. Consider how we really haven't seen anyone looking directly at the viewer. We're used to this idea of portraiture and of looking at the camera, but this was not common whatsoever during this time period or before, really. So the hands. One thing to note is people talk about, I have students ask why she doesn't have any eyebrows. That was intentional. It was really popular at the time period. So consider right now how, like, in style, it's fashionable for girls to have very thick eyebrows. They draw it in, etc. Back in my day, girls had very thin, like almost pencil line eyebrows. Fashion always goes, it fluctuates from like big and small and big and small. At least my sister says that, and she's an actual fashion designer she's a head designer in New York City. But anyway, and so during this time period, it was fashionable to have no eyebrows, that you would shave them off. And so that may sound silly to us, but consider how when you look at decades ago at different forms of fashion, how things look silly, but it was popular at the time. It'll happen to us right now. Anyway, so she has this enigmatic smile. She has this veil over her head, so he's showing off his skill in different patterns. She has this thick clothing. And so there's our Mona Lisa, an icon of art. Now let's talk about Raphael, one of our other masters of the Renaissance. And here's our School of Athens. So we are in the heart of Rome, the heart of papal authority, and we are in Pope Julius II's house at St. Peter's. So he was the Pope from 1503 to 1513. Remember how I talked about how he is spending fortune on the arts, essentially. Part of why he's doing this part of how he's able to afford these artworks is this new idea of indulgences. It had been around for a little bit, but he really utilizes it. And this is where you can pretty much pay the church and get a ticket to forgive you of your sins. And so these funds are what he uses to patronize these artworks. You can imagine, you could be just the biggest jerk in real life and go back up to the church, purchase your little indulgence so that you're forgiven for your sins and go to heaven despite how terrible you are. Of course, this leads to a lot of corruption, and one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation to come this century. He also threatened artists, we'll talk about with Michelangelo, threatened them with excommunication. In other words, saying that they were not allowed to go into heaven. So here we have, within the Vatican, his home, where the Pope today even resides. Vatican City is its own separate city within Rome. And so here we have what was in the library, essentially, the School of Athens. Or not the library, the reception room. Not like a large library like what we think of today, but underneath these would have been shelves of books. And so underneath our School of Athens would have been these books of philosophy, etc. Think of the Athenians. They're the origin of many of the philosophies in which this time period is studying. Yeah, so here we have this painting. Raphael painted it. So let's go into it. We have this orderly, symmetrical, balanced composition. We have our classical elements. We're still utilizing classical antiquity themes from the positions of these bodies. Think of the contrapposto pose. They're wearing togas. even though the Greeks didn't utilize that as much. It was mostly the Romans. But anyway, classical antiquity. The interior looks like a building from classical antiquity, even the sculptures, etc. This coffered ceiling, the arches. So we're still, very much influenced by classical antiquity. And so this artwork is divided into two halves, and it's celebrating these great thinkers. So here we have Plato in the red toga, and where he is pointing upward to the sky. So he's thinking upward and expanding above and really coming up with these new ideas, the heavens for philosophy, for trying to understand the world. And all these figures over to the right of him correspond with this idea of this Plato philosophy created by Plato. But then we have Aristotle in the blue, okay? And his hands draw your attention to the ground. And so he's looking more for like the practical aspect of nature and observation, etc. And so we have the figures over on his side are more along this lines of his philosophy. Some of our classical events. So we have many of these major thinkers in history. These ancient philosophers, our school of Athens. You don't need to know those names. But fun play is Raphael has included a portrait of himself. So consider that status of the artist where he is portraying himself. He's showing off that he's created this artwork. He wants this recognition. He's the only one looking at the viewer, which isn't the norm, so our attention is drawn to him. He wants to make sure he is noticed. And rightly so. I mean, look at this incredible artwork. Here's a preparatory drawing. Massive. The cartoon, which was placed against the wall, which you would probably poke these holes along the outlines and then know where to paint, etc. The interior is modeled off of the Pantheon in Rome with this coffered ceiling. More of these hexagon shapes, I think. It's also divided into what's referred to as the 10 pillars of knowledge. You don't need to know those, but I just want to really remark upon how well thought out and executed this painting is. I mean, he's really considered the grouping of these figures, the depictions and who they're placed with, etc. Those who studied knowledge, the supernatural, matter and energy, space and earth, organisms, looking up to this more ethereal thought. Body and mind, Aristotle, looking to more practical society, thought and art, technology, history, a little more concrete FY, versus like the supernatural, etc. And he has also included Michelangelo, who was known as a grumpy introvert. He didn't have time for the nonsense of interacting with people and friends. We'll see why. I mean, incredible. And so he is depicting this individual, this philosopher is extremely moody, that he's contemplating. He's not interacting with anyone else. Most of the other figures were grouped together, and so he modeled it off of Michelangelo, who was known to be like that. So there he is a little bit in his youth. Heraclitus. So here, let's talk about Michelangelo, and one of the most incredible sculptors of history, and his Pietà. Michelangelo Buonarroti. So he had been patronized by the Medici, until, of course, the fall of the Medici, and he left Florence and went to Venice, Bologna, and then to Rome. And so he lived here for a period of time. Now, the Pietà depicts a moment in which Mary is holding her deceased son. He has just been taken down from the cross, where he was brutally crucified. We'll see other scenes where Christ has been taken down from the cross and he's surrounded by numerous figures, and that's called the Lamentation. It's the name given to that. The Pietà is specifically just mother and child. Okay, this very sad moment. We can see this, it's not a dramatic, theatrical depiction of grief, of sorrow, but we see this moment of like the shocked contemplation of holding her dead son. So, side note, the Pietà is actually more of a northern European theme. We don't really see the Pietà in Italy. It's not common, it's not popular. However, he was patronized by a French cardinal who was living in Rome. So this is why we have a northern European theme here, just FYI. Again, so the church is sponsoring works of art. There's another key difference, obviously, between the early Renaissance and High Renaissance. And so, yeah, we have this pyramid composition that we talked about, in which Mary and Christ are often associated with, especially Mary. This triangular composition. So we could be analyzing a line and how our eyes are drawn around, and of course figure style. This idealized, extremely realistic Christ here. Now let's compare other depictions of Christ. I skipped over this one. This is a Verrocchio. Here's our Fra Lippi. And these interactions between them. Here, she's not looking directly at Christ. There's this real sense of contemplation. Because remember, the idea is that she knew what was to come even before birth. Now, this artwork I want to use to introduce the concept of agency. So, agency, what I mean by that is that artworks affect people. That the artworks themselves have agency. We like to think of ourselves as humans, that we're these primary players, that we're the actors that affect other people. But when you think about it, art affects us. We have emotional reactions to it. These artworks have agency. I wrote about this in my master's thesis, and it's such a key component with understanding so much art across the globe and how many cultures around the world really believe in this idea of art having such an effect on humanity. And this is accurate when you consider iconoclasm and vandalism. So iconoclasm is this destruction of icons, this destruction of art. And we talked about, even with that bonfire, the vanities, even in modern times when art is destroyed across the globe, in the U.S. recently, by ISIS abroad, etc. It's because that art has power, that art affects people, that art is important, it's a sign of culture. And so here's an example of one. In 1972, this mentally disturbed guy went at this with a hammer. And so he got her arm, and her nose was chipped off. And so here is one of these big examples of where the Pietà affects so many people. So popular, but it's one of those where, like, you walk into it's as soon as you walk into St. Peter's Basilica, you turn to the right, and it's just incredible. I went there, I've been to Rome 3 times, and just appreciated it more and more each time, and the effect that it has on those who view it. It's like all these artworks, or pictures on a screen don't give it any justice. But anyway, so art has agency, it affects the viewers. And so I want you to remember that throughout the course of history. And when we study other parts of the world, how this becomes even more important in understanding the artworks. Compare it to Donatello's David. Oh, well, no, let's not go there yet. Sorry. Another thing to note for Michelangelo's Pietà is the size and proportions of the body. In order to accommodate holding her full-grown son, who died around the age of 33, Michelangelo made Mary extremely large. Some art historians have measured the proportions of her body, and if she were to stand up, she would be about 8 feet tall. Consider how wide her legs are, how large her body is. Her face looks generally proportional, similar to Christ, but the actual body, and especially her legs, are built to or the proportions accommodate holding Christ. Realistically, she should be much smaller than him. We wouldn't gain this same sense of sorrow of holding her son, of her child, had he attempted to create realistic proportions. But you probably wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't pointed it out. He does so subtly. And the sense of cloth and drapery looks realistic. The figures look realistic. I mean, look how he makes this look like heavy clothing, heavy material, textile, when it's stone. It's incredible. Okay, and we'll talk about his David versus Donatello's tomorrow.